need to be away this evening. So I'm going to start early. It's 4:30, and let's go ahead and talk a little bit. Your final exam is coming up on Tuesday, Wednesday/Thursday, depending on your class section. Um, excuse me. And I think everybody should know where they are grade-wise at this point. I think I've graded everything that people have submitted to this point. There's a couple of you that I have made some special arrangements with because of some travel issues. But anyway, all that stuff should be in by this point if it's not already. So you should know what your grade is and what you need to do in order to get the grade that you would like to to come out with. I will say that I think our review is pretty helpful this time. It's pretty specific, getting into exactly what it is that you need to do. Most of you should have also gotten feedback on your presentation. Most of the presentations were good. Most of them did what I needed them to do. Some of the areas that I think needed a little bit of work were related to who is your audience, what is your who in government would you use or want to help make this happen and make this possible? Those were some of the things that I feel like were a little bit not there. But for the most part, everybody did a pretty good job. And as far as collaboration, from what I can tell from the evaluation forms, everybody did a really good job. You had some great teamwork, some great collaboration, or at least if you didn't, you were pretty forgiving to your classmates on those things, because that was not an issue that seemed to arise in the follow-up evaluations. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about the test that is scheduled for Wednesday and Thursday. It does have a writing component. So I would like to draw your attention to the review, those 2 writing prompts. You will need to be able to discuss in detail the things that you have learned throughout the semester. Okay, so be able to talk about those things. I mean, you may have 3 or 4 or 5 things that you can write about and discuss and describe that you've learned about Texas government, right? I need to see your learning. I need you to be reflective. So think about those things. The question is not going to be that different from what I gave you. I may have some more specifics and some more details on it, but not all that different from what's presented on the review. The other one deals with your own learning. And some things that went well this semester, some things that that were helpful for you, some things you learned about how you learned, some things that I did to help you, and feel free also to have a list of maybe areas that could have been better for you, and be able to enlighten me on some of those kind of things as well, because this is a learning process for me as well, and I want to be able to learn from you guys and take from this experience also, it's not just about you learning, but it's about me also. So I want you to be able to know more about how you learn and what works best for you. So as you move forward in your coursework and in towards a degree or towards whatever your goals are in life, you'll have that ability to do that. Yeah, I need that feedback as well. Okay, let's talk about the specifics of the test. So as I said before, the test really covers 11, 12, and 13. A lot of it's 11 and 12. 13 is really not that much on the test, but there are probably 3 or 4 questions. So I'm just going to go down the review and talk about that. So describe the relationship between spending and taxation in Texas. So what does that relationship look like? Like we've talked about multiple times throughout the course of the year, Texas doesn't like to spend much money. They don't raise many taxes. They don't have a lot of sources of revenue. Therefore they don't spend much. So they're kind of a low service, low tax state, meaning that they don't provide much and they don't pay for much. Okay. Now we do have multiple sources of income, or revenue. We just don't use an income tax in Texas. We're one of the few states that don't. We do use the sales tax. We do use corporate business taxes. We use property taxes. A lot of those kinds of things. As opposed to an income tax. One of the things that you might want to remember, though, is that a sales tax is fundamentally regressive, meaning that people that make less actually end up paying a higher portion of their income into a sales tax. Even though the percentage is the same, it's not the same in terms of disposable income, right? So if everyone's paying a flat 8%, someone who's poor can't afford 8% as easily as someone who is maybe wealthier. Okay, be able to describe how higher education is funded. There are several different pools of money. There are several different places where that money comes from. Know about the land grant colleges and which colleges those are. So your UT and A&M. How are they funded? How is the funding system for them different? And how has the funding system changed in the last 20 years, especially as it relates to the legislature and tax dollars and tuition? I know a lot of you are concerned about the cost of tuition. That's a big deal. One of my groups did their project on that. Know that has changed, but from the time that I was an undergrad in 1996 through 2001, which wasn't that long ago, there's been some drastic changes in the way that college education is funded, especially when it comes to tuition. Colleges are much more tuition dependent than they used to be 20 years ago or 25 years ago. Various sources of revenue and taxes that the state relies on. We've talked about that. Describe how K-12 education is funded. So we'll be talking about things like the permanent school fund and, what kind of authority does the legislature have versus the State Board of Education versus those kind of groups. So just kind of know where those funds kind of come from. Know that when we're talking about revenue, there are pros and cons to a state income tax. As I said before, it is regressive, and so some people are pushing for. An income tax is progressive, where a sales tax is regressive. So there's lots of people that are pushing for the state to adopt an income tax to balance out and share the funding in some more direct and equitable ways. Arguments for and against the state income. We got that. Relationship between Texas and the federal government in regard to federal spending. So understand the way that federal funding works in Texas, understand where it comes from, understand where it goes, understand the kind of general philosophy and ideas about this. This gets back into federalism and be able to talk about awarding funds and block grants and how those funds are distributed. Usually, the federal government issues a mandate and the states pay for it, or the federal government will give the states money to fund certain programs, or sometimes the states will petition or apply for different kinds of things. Know things like that. So those are some important things when it comes to revenue and when it comes to funding. What kind of federal limits does the state constitution put on federal government to different programs, right? For example, aid to families with needy children, for example. Is a state constitutionally mandated cap on that. What does that cap look like? Or what are some caps or some constraints on some of those other programs that they tend to have? Okay. Discuss the definition and characteristic of public policy. So public policy basically is when a government decides how it's going to solve a problem or create a solution or take care of something within their societies. What kind of goals do they have, and how do they meet those goals? Usually using incentives and sanctions. So they're really going to make it, give people a positive reason to support it, or there may be some negative reasons not to. So that's public policy. Understand what the cycle of public policy creation is. So what are those steps, right? So things like implementation, evaluation, there's multiple steps in that process. You should understand what those are, because at the end of the day, you need to know how public policy comes about, how it's created, what are the goals of it. All those kinds of things are very important to understanding and knowing how we do that. Okay. Know a little bit about de jure versus de facto segregation. We talked about this a little bit earlier in the year. I think when we were talking about, probably when we were talking about voting and elections, probably this came up. De facto versus de jure. So de jure segregation, or de jure, depending on how you say it, is segregation that is by laws, mandated by law, so things like Jim Crow in the South, things like anti-slave laws or fugitive slave laws back in the 1800s. All of those things were de jure. So if you had to fight it or wanted to fight it, you had to physically actually change the law itself. Okay. De facto argues that segregation exists because of unconscious or unofficial structures in our societies, right? So choices that people make, choices that institutions make that are not necessarily in following the law or are required by law, but they're just things people do. For example, there's been a big debate or conversation in public education, in K-12 education, about what's called a resegregation of schools, especially urban schools. And that resegregation is based around the idea not that there were formal laws put in place like there were back in the times of Jim Crow, but that basically what happened is because of migration, because of people moving, that a lot of poor urban communities found themselves heavily segregated racially, ethnically, and economically, because those who could afford to move out did, and went to the suburbs and created their own communities elsewhere. So what this left was these de facto segregated schools. Now, nobody required this. Nobody said it was going to happen. No one said we must do this. But because of the natural choices that those who had the power and ability to make choices made, the consequence of that, intended or unintended, was to create these segregated communities. Know what some of the challenges to education policy. So there's basically three categories of policy that the book talks about. Okay, one is education policy. There's lots of discussion about education policy, funding, curriculum, state board of education, legislature, all those kind of things. Okay, so what are some of the challenges to that? Right, obviously you've got a large state, you have high numbers of students that do not speak English or speak limited English or come from very poor backgrounds. You have a huge income gap. You have federal mandates on testing and on outcomes that put a considerable amount of constraints on your ability to educate children. All those things are things that have to come into play and be considered when we're talking about education funding, or I'm sorry, education policy. Okay, and of course, segregation, in this case, mostly de facto, is one of those things. Okay, public school finance problems, right? Problems with equalizing funding. So talk a little bit about Robin Hood. Talk about property tax and tax property wealthy versus property poor districts, and how those things can create problems in trying to create some different some equal outcomes to different groups of children. Okay, so understand how those different kinds of things. One of the other big ones is poverty. So public policy in terms of education, public policy in terms of poverty are some big ones that the state deals with. And it's because the poverty is something that the federal government has made a priority, and therefore the states have made it a priority as well. And a lot of the discussion about anti-poverty campaigns comes back to state, that's when the federal funding really comes into play, and how much is the federal government willing to pitch in to help offset the cost of providing for poor kids and providing for poor people in Texas. And excuse me, Texas has a growing gap when it comes to poverty, simply because of immigration and because of the increase in the income gap. So know how that's measured in terms of outcomes. How do we know that we're being successful? How do we know if we're not being successful in terms of those particular poverty outcomes? Okay, and then knowing that most of those things are fought through things like Medicare and Medicaid, through food programs like food stamps or aid to dependent children, WIC, programs like that are designed to help student or kids and families that are struggling with poverty, but also that the states bear a large burden for paying for that. And so, how does Texas deal with that? How does Texas come around to how to deal with that? Okay, know that Texas has a large poverty rate relative to some other states. It's higher than a lot of the rest of the state, significantly higher than most of the rest of the state. Part of that is because we don't like to pay for things. Part of that is because of our libertarian leaning. But part of that is also we just happen to have a lot more poor people that need a lot of help, and it's not easy. It's not an easy problem to fix. But understanding how that kind of works. Understand Social Security, how that process works, and the significance of that as a way to fight poverty, especially among the elderly and the disabled. Understand that the number of people that a welfare program or a poverty program is successful if people are getting off of it and getting jobs. So the number of people on the government system versus those that are cycling off is what we really want to look at. All right. The Affordable Care Act is something that's really interesting. Understand that we don't know much about its impact on Texas. We don't know much about its impact on any specific state. It just hasn't been around long enough. It may not be around long enough for us to really study it very closely. What we do know, though, is that the court has multiple times argued that it is a constitutional thing, especially the being able to tax is constitutional, because it is that's the power of Congress is to create taxes. That's one of their powers. So, all right. Know some things about water rights, and especially the conflict between we're balancing a public good, which is access to water, versus a private good, which is land ownership and land rights and things like that. Grand juries, pros and cons of grand juries, what's good about them, what's not good about them. Understand a little bit about a plea bargain and the plea bargain system. This is all from Chapter 13, these last couple of things. Understanding that the point of a plea bargain is to lessen the burden on the court system. It is to get it is to punish people and try to make the system work in a more efficient and economic way. If you took everybody to trial, it would be an incredible burden on the system. So those defendants or those accused people that are perhaps less dangerous, or perhaps aren't necessarily the most deserving of a particular punishment, are often going to get a lesser punishment. Or and once again, that's a strategic choice made by the district attorney. The ability to say, hey, instead of giving you 20 years, we're going to give you 7 with these conditions. Okay. Know that very rarely, if ever, hold on one second. Okay. And usually, in order for a defendant to take a plea bargain, there's going to have to be something in it for them. They're going to have to get a better deal in some way. But rarely, rarely. I mean, that's a very common thing. In fact, the majority of people that are arrested and are charged with crimes usually have some kind of plea bargain to get that out of the way, just because it's easier to do that. It's cheaper, it's faster, and most of the time, people usually did the crime and know that they're going to be found guilty if they go to court. So they're willing to take the plea bargain and just say, "All right, you got me. What do we need to do to get this done?" Now, that's not to imply that innocent until proven guilty isn't a thing, but as we talked about in our judiciary chapter, it kind of is. This does kind of challenge some of those assumptions. And finally, let's talk about the Texas prison system. There's been lots of issues with the Texas prison system over the years. There's a lot that have led to some oversight that need to be put in place. Some things such as prison boards, such as review committees, things like that, to oversee the process and the way that the prisons are run, how they hire, what they do with inmates, and how inmates are treated. Another thing that I didn't put specifically say on the review that you may want to know is if you are paroled from jail or prison, what are some challenges that you face? And this is one of the reasons why we see a high rate of what we call recidivism, which is people going back to jail after they've been paroled or after they've been let out. That recidivism rate is high because of certain conditions and certain things that happen. So be thinking about some of those kinds of things. Let me scroll back through here and see what I have. Yes, and there are 2 writing prompts at the end. I will provide you some paper to write those on, so don't worry about that. It will be a shorter test than usual. It'll be 25 questions, not 30 or 33. So there'll be 3 points apiece. Those writing prompts will be about 25 points total, and that'll give you kind of a heads up on that. I'm just skimming through to see if I've hit the highlights of the review and to make sure there's not anything on here that is important to make sure that you understand. Permanent school fund, know what that is. Permanent university funds, federal matching funds. What is policy? Stages of policy. I mentioned all these things already. Challenges facing education. Blah, blah, blah. Different funding schemes. That looks like that's pretty much it. Yeah, this is a short test, 25 questions. The review is pretty specific. If it's not on the review, then you know, most of it's going to be on the review. I'm not going to say it's 100% there because I may have missed something, but you know, if you do the work on the review and you study that really good, you reread the chapters, you look at your notes again, you should do well. There's not a lot of gotcha questions. I don't think there's any, and I think it's pretty straightforward. All right, so remember to work on those writing prompts. Make sure you have those ready to go when you come to class, because you will need to do well on those. They're free points if you are prepared. They're not free points if you're not prepared. All right, so just be prepared for that. Most of you, your grades are pretty good. Hopefully, they're where you want them to be. If they're not, then the final is a chance for you to improve that. And if you study hard, the final should not sink you or tank you too bad. At least I hope not. So that's kind of where we are right now. And yeah, that's about it. So in general, if I don't get a chance to talk to you this week, it's been a great semester. I am physically worn out and exhausted from my commuting and working late on school nights, and I will not be teaching in the spring because I just can't do it during the school year. That is not a reflection on you guys. You guys have been awesome. You've been great. You've participated. You've been engaged. You really have made this semester fun for me. I hope it's been fun for you as well. well. I've tried to give you opportunities to show your learning in lots of different ways, and most of you have really seized that opportunity, and I appreciate that. That makes me feel good, makes me feel like I'm doing something purposeful. That being said, you will always be my students. You may not, I may not have you in class again. I may or may not, but I do not. I would like to still stay in contact with you guys. So, excuse me. You can follow me on Twitter, or follow me on Facebook. I'd love to be Facebook friends with you guys, so I can continue to follow where you go and the great things that you're doing, and see your ridiculous elf on the shelf pictures, whatever, things like that. So my screen name on Facebook is Brian, Brian, Edward, Edward. My Twitter handle is Jed Bartlett 2016. Yes, I'm a West Wing fan, so you can follow me on those areas, and I can follow you, and we can keep in touch, because I really do care about you guys. I've really grown to appreciate and care about you, and I want to see how you do. So if it's not too lame to be to friend me, go ahead and do that, so we can keep in touch. But anyway. That's about all I have. If there are urgent questions that you come across as you're studying that I have not covered in the review, email me. I cannot guarantee that I will be able to get to them. Mondays and Tuesdays are super, super busy for me because of my Wednesday and Thursday commitments. But I will try to get those to you. If for some reason you feel there is an error in your grade, there is an error in me putting something in, some of you have sent me some emails saying, "Hey, what about this?" And I have tried to correct that. If you have not done that, if you need to do that, go ahead. I'm not going to guarantee anything since our deadline was Friday, but I will do that. Also, you can talk to me on exam day, and I'll see what I can do then. Other than that, guys, it's been a great semester. Study hard, get some rest, and I look forward to hearing from you. All right, bye.